I think there was a real duality to the personality of Jesse James.
He was this uncatchable, plucky rebel type sticking it to the man.
He was a very complex and significant figure.
Jesse James, they say, was America's Robin Hood.
He could literally shoot somebody just as easily as snap his fingers.
Go! Even the toughest of the bunch is going to be scared of Jesse James.
Do you have a young kid who is obsessed with celebrity, who's been humiliated and sees celebrity as a way out?
He goes from being a 19-year-old kid who had read a comic book about Jesse James and was a fan to then ultimately having to kill him and then being killed himself.
Jesse has been sort of an enigma. You've had this layer of folklore, this layer of fiction for well over a century now.
I knew the folklore image of him as this Robin Hood kind of character that was later uncovered that he could be quite dastardly.
Most of the fiction and Hollywood portrayals of Jesse James show this man a character of the Old West. But really, the evidence doesn't support that.
What disturbed me about the earlier manifestations is that the relationship between Bob Ford and Jesse James was usually simplified. The relationship was far more complicated than anybody had ever presented. So I decided to do my own version, and I thought there was a Shakespearean tragedy in some ways, where you took people who were really larger than life and showed their fatal flaw. Jesse James, it was his kind of vaingloriousness, his sense of being superior to anybody he encountered. I thought that that needed to be said in a novel form where you can hypothesize more than you can in history.
Ron's book sort of portrayed Jesse James as a Prince Hamlet or something, this dithery, depressed, manic person wandering around in the ashes of his life that was created by his younger self.
It's the seeking aspect of Bob Ford and his stubbornness, and that was his Achilles heel. And I think we were all in concert about what must have gone on.
And it has to go back to the struggle of the South after the war and Reconstruction.
Jesse James grew up in Clay County in western Missouri. And Clay County was an extension of the South in the middle of this border state of Missouri.
It was kind of a typical lower middle class Southern upbringing. They had slaves, they had a small little farm in Missouri. With his father abandoning his mother, young Jesse James had kind of the typical awkward childhood.
His mother, Zerelda James, underwent a series of estate auctions in which many of their possessions were auctioned off. Those years of seeing their home being taken over, in essence, by county officials, of being without a father, it had to have had some effect on his personality. She was very tall. Some sources describe her as nearly 6 feet tall, at a time when most men were averaging around 5'7" or 5'8". She was someone who was described by almost everyone who met her as an extremely forceful, powerful, intelligent, and above all, sharp-tongued woman.
With all the rumors that were attendant to her kind of awkward life, I think there was a psychological burden to being the son of Z. James.
In Jesse James's teenage years, we would expect him to be going to school, to be working on the farm, to be thinking about what he might be doing in just a few years when he reaches adulthood. But he started at the age of 13 as a child in the midst of a guerrilla war.
When the Civil War happened, that was a rupture in the fabric of American society, and I think that afflicted him in particular ways because it felt like the honor of the South that he'd embraced was at stake.
It was a cultural issue as well. Jesse James's outspoken mother was a very fierce advocate of the Southern cause, and her boys followed suit. So Frank James sided with the South and went off to fight with the South at the very start of the Civil War.
when the farm was raided by Union militia. The experience, I'd say, was brutalizing for Jesse.
Militiamen for the Union side stormed onto the farm, beat Jesse himself as he worked in the field, and put a rope around his stepfather's neck and briefly hung him from a tree, torturing him in order to get information on where Frank James, Jesse's older brother, was hiding. It's often said that Jesse James became a Confederate guerrilla to seek revenge for the Union militia raid on his family farm in May 1863.
Jesse James was about 16 years old when he joined the ranks of the Confederate guerrillas. That's very, very young. If you were a regular soldier, he was in a particularly violent part of the war, which was the guerrilla fighting, the partisan warfare. But he did look up to these older men, and Bloody Bill Anderson was one of the men that Jesse looked up to.
Bloody Bill Anderson was the worst of the worst, with the possible exception of one of his chief lieutenants, a very small, very young guerrilla named Archie Clement. Archie Clement was described as Bill Anderson's head devil. They always shot prisoners, and then they usually mutilated their bodies. He was famous for popularizing the custom of scalping the dead.
And they would send Jesse into like a Union bivouac with a tanning knife, and he would slit 6 soldiers' throats. And Jesse was at the massacre in Centralia where they pulled soldiers off the train and stripped them naked and shot them.
Was Jesse James shaped by this experience? Absolutely. It's inconceivable that he could have been the man he was without having been a Confederate guerrilla, especially under some of the most brutal men in American history.
Jesse James and Frank James got used to the idea of terrorizing people, and I think they liked the freedom of that, and they liked the power that was inherent in that position. And he just kind of carried that on after the war ended.
The guerrilla fighters are accepted by the Confederacy up to a point, and then they go too far, and they're actually repudiated and outlawed by the Confederacy, as well as by the North.
Jesse James was badly wounded in 1865 when they ran into a group of Wisconsin cavalrymen. This was a month after Lee surrendered at Appomattox.
Jesse ended up taking a .36 caliber Colt Navy ball in his right chest. Jesse, I think, felt that he was possibly terminally wounded.
There was an incredibly long courtship, during a lot of which she was nursing him. I think she did wield a certain kind of power in a way, her own kind of power.
He was essentially marrying inside of the family, which was not that peculiar back then because there was not that big a population of people to choose from, especially for men to choose women.
The South, having been defeated in the Civil War, is going through all of the struggles about Reconstruction.
All across the South after the war, it was very, very hard times, and people were suffering. The post-war events are what affected Jesse more than the events of the war.
Because of the new state constitution enacted by the radical hardline Unionists, Confederates had no voice in the political process.
Let's go!
The key to Jesse James's transition from Confederate guerrilla into bandit was Archie Clement. Now, Archie Clement was the chief survivor of Bloody Bill Anderson's guerrilla group after Bloody Bill was killed in 1864. Archie Clement decided to target Unionist officials and banks associated with Unionists.
Ex-Confederates really wanted to remove the radical Republican measures that were being imposed on them.
Came to a climax on Election Day, 1866, when Archie Clement led his group into the town of Lexington. And he actually took over the town on Election Day, and the radicals lost the election as a result. The governor sent in the state militia. They cornered Archie Clement in a bar, a wild gunfight ensued, and Archie was eventually shot down in front of the county courthouse. It was an event that we know scarred Jesse James for the rest of his life. Jesse James faced a choice. Either he would give up the guerrilla life or he would decide to pursue it. He chose to carry on Archie Clement's legacy, to continue the life of robbery and of attacking his old enemies.
Jesse James joined up with Cole Younger and his brothers early on, and Cole Younger was one of the bloodiest of the outlaws at that period. Jesse was drawn to that type of person who was willing to exert his own power and authority over other people.
The James Younger gang is not the only gang of its kind. I think it's unique in that it's picked up by the press.
The name Jesse James would not have been known to the public until after the Gallatin robbery in 1869.
In the town of Gallatin, in Daviess County, Missouri, he robbed a bank and shot down the teller who he mistakenly believed was the Union militia officer who had been responsible for the death of Bloody Bill Anderson. Now that incident is interesting because Jesse James's name got into the press for the first time.
Jesse James had a wonderful publicist in John Newman Edwards who wrote about his robberies as if they're feats of daring do. He created the myth of Jesse James and Frank James as being Robin Hood.
And Edwards is the guy who starts putting Jesse forward as a symbol of the Confederates who would have made peace, but the Yankees wouldn't let them. They continued to abuse and oppress them after the war. And Jesse finds that very convenient.
There was another movement during this time period that was very important to Jesse, and that was the Granger movement. The Granger movement wanted to basically control the railroads because they felt that the railroads and big business were exploiting the farmers. Farmers would have been applauding the James gang when they hit those trains. So that if you ask the question, was Jesse James a hero or a Robin Hood? Well, yes, he was, to Southerners.
He represents a kind of mythology of resistance to railroad building and displacement of small farmers by the new commercial order by railroads, by banks lending money to farmers and then putting them out of business.
I'm Jesse James, the man you read so much about. Jesse James, well, I'll be damned.
During train robberies, he started to write notes himself, a description of the train robbery, a description of himself, and he would give it to the conductors or someone on the train so that that would be printed.
He liked seeing his name in the paper, and some of his actions in robbing people seemed to have been there simply so that people would have a great anecdote that would work well in the paper.
The railroad corporations decide that he's a significant enemy and single him out by sending the Pinkerton detectives after him. And the Pinkertons are a private detective agency, but they are in effect the only national police force we've got. They're the equivalent of the FBI.
Jesse James emerged as a major figure for a number of reasons. One was that he carried out daring crimes and he got away with it. He was on the lam for years.
They traveled through Virginia, they traveled through North Carolina, they were in Georgia, and they also went up north. They went to New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. So the bottom line is these men were in the East. The reason that Jesse James was never captured in the West is because he wasn't there. He was in the East.
In 1876, Reconstruction essentially collapsed. It also happened to be the year that Jesse James's gang was decimated at Northfield, Minnesota. Northfield should have been their most daring crime, striking into the heart of the North, striking a bank that they believed correctly was connected to a prominent Union war hero and Republican politician. But it was a disaster.
One of the younger brothers was bleeding very badly, and they were trying to escape from the town. And Jesse suggested that that brother would be shot and be put out of his misery so that they would not be having to drag a body around. And from that point on, Cole Younger and none of the younger brothers ever had anything to do with Jesse James.
Jesse James confronted two facts. One, he was still seen as almost superhuman by the public. On the other hand, he had suffered his worst defeat. So he went into hiding with Frank James.
I think there was a real duality to the personality of Jesse James. He was a man who would find it easy to shoot at people and rob banks. Simultaneously, he was a loyal family man who would sing in the choir at church. So there was a sense in which he was constantly splitting himself. I think fundamentally he was a psychopath. He exhibits almost all the characteristics. The one exception was his deep relationship with his wife and his children. There seems to be no doubt that he was always faithful to her and did whatever he could to preserve their way of life in a very simple way. He assumed all kinds of aliases just in order to keep her and his children safe. In fact, his children never even knew his name was Jesse. He was called Dave, usually in their presence.
Z and the children had aliases. They called Jesse Jr. Tim. And whenever he was around other members of the family, like Frank James, his uncle Ben, they always used these aliases, even into their later lives.
Jesse James was not able to lead the hardworking, peaceful life that Frank was able to step into. His desire for excitement, plus his desire for celebrity, plus the fact that he was broke, led him back into a life of crime. There were no more letters to the newspaper. There were no more newspaper editorials talking about the Civil War and Reconstruction politics as being part of what he was doing as a bandit.
Post-Civil War, all the states were trying to create an identity. They wanted people to move there. They wanted the war to be over. And Jesse was getting in the way of all that.
He became unbalanced and began to push his own agenda, even though it was still reflective of the ex-Confederate movement to get rid of the radicals. People were not seeing that it was necessary anymore, that times were moving on.
He began to draw toward him local ruffians, people who were not old enough to have experienced the Civil War firsthand as he had, people who did not have that sense of loyalty, let alone the training that being a Confederate guerrilla would bring.
He didn't care who was going to be in the gang with him. He thought he could control any situation. So he started picking people who were available, people who seemed to idolize him.
In the case of the Fords, it proved to be a fatal mistake.
Jesse was introduced to Bob and Charlie Ford by members of the gang that were basically Jesse's neighbors, this being Ed Miller and Jim Cummings.
For Bob Ford and for the Ford family, coming from Jesse's part of the country, he's a local hero. He's a living legend in a way for that community that transcends what he is for the rest of the nation, because it's reality for them. They know the James family. They know the Younger family.
You have a guy who's trapped behind his celebrity. You have a young kid who is obsessed with celebrity, who's been humiliated and sees celebrity as a way out. Robert Ford hitches his start to Jesse, the celebrity of that day.
Jesse was kind of like a rock star in a way, and I think Bob Ford was just enamored of him, the way a kid would be of a basketball star or of somebody.
You know, it's like typical sort of fan stalker stuff where he's got an imagined relationship with this person that he idolizes, but it doesn't bear much resemblance to reality.
What was important to Robert Ford was Jesse James. And he read everything there was to read about him, all the newspaper articles, all the comic books, anything he could get his hands on.
He may have also seen that by association, he might become sort of a historical figure himself.
He believed that being close to Jesse would then open up doors for him to something great. And it didn't. It felt more like doors were closing.
The gang was beginning to fall apart. And then Bob Ford became involved in an episode that sealed his fate.
Bob had been in a gunfight over in Richmond County with Jesse's first cousin, Wood Height.
It is believed that Bob Ford fired the fatal shot that killed Wood Height. So the fact is that Bob Ford and Dick Little at that point knew that they had to do something because they had killed Jesse James' favorite cousin.
The governor, meanwhile, was issuing an unprecedented reward offer.
The fee had been upped to, I think, $10,000, which was a huge amount of money back then. You could buy a house for $800, so $10,000 was quite a piece of change.
That's when Charlie starts to realize that things aren't going so well. And then after that, Bob puts him in the middle by saying, you know, I've been hired to arrest or kill Jesse James. Charlie becomes really conflicted between his loyalty to Jesse, because he really looks up to Jesse, and his loyalty to his brother, and he doesn't know what to do.
Jesse must have had a sense that the end was near. He himself had scared away one gang member, had killed another one had disappeared. He little realized that he'd been shot dead. Ironically, Jesse James's own suspicion and paranoia had left him with only 2 followers, who were Bob and Charlie Ford.
It is true that he gave the gift of the weapon to his would-be assassin. He gave him the gun that would kill him. That in itself is curious.
Jesse had read in the newspaper that Dick Little had been captured and that he was apparently involved in some way with the law.
Jesse James knew that the noose was tightening around him.
Both Bob and Charlie Ford told the press that they had been waiting for their opportunity, but it seemed like it would never come, because Jesse always had his guns and he was always suspicious of everyone. I think that on the fateful day when he took off his guns, his sense of invulnerability was just a little bit larger than his sense of caution. One outweighed the other, just enough to give the Ford brothers their chance.
It was a strange thing to do, and it was a fatal mistake for sure.
Jesse falls on the floor. He's bleeding all over the place. Z hears the shot, comes into the room, and Bob and Charlie are pleading. It was an accident. The gun went off, and she says the gun went off accidentally on purpose. She knows what's happened there.
Bob Ford killed Jesse James April 3rd, 1882. They never attempted to capture Jesse James. They shot him in the back of the head, unarmed, in his house after a conspiratorial meeting with the governor of a state.
Bob Ford joined with Governor Crittenden and the other law people for a number of reasons, and they're all combined simultaneously. One is fame, that if he would kill off this famous outlaw, he would become the most celebrated man in America, which came true. Another was money.
After he kills Jesse James, he thinks that everyone is going to treat him like a hero, and they do for a minute, but it's mostly just out of fascination.
Well, the immediate aftermath of Jesse James's death was rejoicing. Hundreds of people flooded into St. Joseph, Missouri to see the body of Jesse James, which is a sign of what a celebrity he'd already become, probably the biggest celebrity in America at that time. Gradually, that feeling changed.
You have this situation where he's done in by a member of the gang who has been staying with him and comes up, shoots him in the side of the head while his back is turned. And I think there was kind of a code of honor back in those days that you didn't do that sort of thing.
I don't think Ford could have predicted the reaction to what he did, because I don't think that he would have had, or anyone at the time could have had, the understanding of what celebrity was becoming in a society which has real mass media, which, by the 1880s, the United States really has the beginnings of a mass media society. He might have expected to be unambiguously accepted as a hero, and he wasn't, but more as an assassin.
The most interesting aspect of that, as far as celebrity is concerned, is this lack of understanding of consequence, or even a lack of caring about consequence.
Bob gets sentenced to death for the murder of Jesse James, and then he's pardoned by the governor.
What are we doing here, Bob? Educating.
He writes a play and travels around the country performing for thousands of people, reenacting what he did.
He was capitalizing on having shot somebody in the back, a person who was purportedly his friend. Created kind of an ethical dilemma for most people. They couldn't really appreciate him in the same way they could a Pat Garrett who shot Billy the Kid. So gradually, the American public turned against him.
After the immediate reaction to Jesse is over, when Jesse James becomes this representative of resistance to wrongdoing by the rich and powerful, especially railroads, that Robert Ford has to then be unambiguously a villain.
The atmosphere changed, and I think the song by Billy Gashade, which has become so famous about how Bob Ford shot Jesse James, was the tipping point. And from that point on, Bob was always called the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard and laid poor Jesse in his grave.
The turning of Robert Ford into the dirty little coward in the song is not that surprising. What makes it his permanent reputation is that it's no longer just the folk community sitting around singing the ballad. The ballad is picked up immediately. It's a Tin Pan Alley kind of song, and it feeds into this national pop culture interest.
He becomes recognizable, but it's because everyone hates him, and he's this like thought of as a coward and a traitor and a murderer.
Charlie Ford actually had a good bit of remorse because he'd been kind of dragged into the matter there at the tail end by his brother.
Charlie Ford, he was never able to deal with it. He finally committed suicide. And Bob Ford went to the mining camps out in Colorado.
He goes out to Creede, Colorado, and becomes a barkeep. That he is despised by most of America after about 1885, and yet manages to build a successful career in Creede, Colorado, to get married and have children.
He's persevering, you know. He's pretty strong and keeps his chin up.
He was not well received, and he had to fear for his life, and finally somebody did get him. Ed Kelly's family was from North Carolina. I believe he thought he was doing the right thing by killing Bob Ford.
After he was killed in the middle of his own saloon, the body was dragged away and the blood was scraped from the floorboards. And that night, the dance went merrily on. I always thought that was kind of sad.
I really felt for Bob. He was a person whose entire life was reduced down to one thing that he'd done when he was 20.
One of the things that stands out about Jesse James is that he's one of the few of that early phase of heroes who's a criminal. So Jesse's legend goes from being a kind of local folklore to a kind of permanent possession of American popular culture.
The fact that Jesse James was shot when he was 34 years old, still in his prime, was crucial to the developing of the James myth. It's very much like Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, all these figures that you see in posters still. Their early death while still in their prime has given them kind of a higher status.
Because Jesse James's crimes are on such an epic scale, because he was such an authentically charismatic and dramatic figure, he was larger than life, and yet when people looked at him from a distance, they didn't look at what he was standing on. They looked at the man himself who had loomed up so high. So as a result, he's become someone who has become malleable in legend. He's been remade again and again.
He's going to continue to remain a little bit of an enigma, at least, because there are a lot of unanswered questions we may never know about because there's no documentation that exists.
As long as we're not sure whether we're for the oppressed or for the oppressors, we're going to be messing with the figure of Jesse James.